So I gave tonight's conversation the rather lofty title of the evolution of ideas of addiction and recovery. And this stemmed from an inspiration that arose on Sunday to once more tell the story of the person called Billy, who I am known as, was over-identified with in the past. And the seeking that went on for that character, and what brought about the end of the seeking for that character, and why it is I'm talking about myself in such a way. There's little doubt, if we look at the world that we inhabit at the moment, that there seems to be a rising emergence of what I would call shadow, but what we might call elsewhere spiritually called darkness. But if we lose the ideas of concepts of light and dark, and positive and negative, and good and bad, all these kind of dualistic terms, or these two different parameters of what's acceptable and what isn't, because these are often laden with our conditioning and our preference and the way in which politics, culture, media, time and tide, and the social acceptability of things in one decade becomes unacceptable in a different decade. The human waltz through time and space certainly evolves, and we might evolve spiritually. But during this time when there's a very strange phenomena passing over the entire earth, usually we might experience things individually. We might have individual struggles. We might have familial struggles within our families. We might have struggles in our home, in our work life, in the roles of our lives. We might have struggles in our communities, in our towns, in our cultures and in our countries, and then across countries and across continents. Suffering certainly does seem to be part of the human experience. And at the moment, there's this very peculiar phenomena that has people in a kind of enforced retreat into their own homes, isn't there? We've all had to simplify, adapt, and part of that, I'm sure we can all acknowledge on some level, has been about having to struggle with the letting go of the way things were before this situation appeared around March. And a descent into that simplicity. It's really nice to want to go on holiday or to take a rest or to even have a day off or enjoy the weekend, but there's a kind of transitional thing that appears, isn't there, where we adapt from a life identified with remorseless doing until we can fully settle into a period or an hour or a day or a weekend or a break or a retreat of being. Most retreats that I've been on are like 3 days, and by about lunchtime on the Sunday, when I'm leaving, about tea time Sunday, I begin to finally arrive. And it's like that for me, and I think it's a process of being moved by the notion of retreat, not just spiritual retreat, but just even a day off, out of the mental faculty of doing into the more body-centered experience of being. So then, again, there is this situation across the globe right now. Very unique phenomena, isn't it, to all be engaged in something. There's probably more countries engaged in this current predicament than there was in any even preceding war. I know we have a war, don't we, that we call the World War. Well, we know that the entire world wasn't involved in the World War. But in fact, we're in a kind of a war, though there's not really a war, there's just what is. Now, that asks of us to restrict access to each other. And some cultures and continents and individuals like that, don't they? The English aren't known to be the most gregarious of peoples. The Americans perhaps somewhat more gregarious, certainly through my English upbringing, it seems like that. English people are often called reserved, aren't they? And on a more crass level, we don't trust people. We don't like each other. you know. But that's a really wounded way of looking at it, but it's a bit like that. So often when I've met a bunch of Canadian people in my time. I met a lot of Canadian people in India, in fact. And what was really interesting was that I could spot Canadian people from American people quite quickly. And what I noticed about all the Canadians I've met, at least, is that they're really nice. I can't say I've met many Americans that I've found objectionable. I really love American culture, and it's a really interesting phenomena. The perception from this country, isn't it, to what America means, the way in which we perhaps politically kowtow to the American consciousness, if you like. Yeah, anyway, so there's this global situation right now, and here we are, and with the onset of internet technology, which is barely 20 years old come the year 2020, there has been an ever-increasing morass and rise in access to information, what we call the World Wide Web. So what information does for people is it sets people free. So now there's this access to more information. Obviously, information that speaks to us as a person, information that is objectionable to us as a person, based on, once more, on conditioning and how we see things from where we are. And often we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are, don't we? So our conditioning comes into that. But out of this emergence of internet technology, the communication barriers that were previously telephones and letters and travel to countries, you know, the developments of the last century has turned into this kind of digital access to increased amounts of information. So with that, and the kind of sense of the global, the unification that comes out of that, even though this country's just voted to be less unified, there's an inevitable coming together of peoples. The unification of peoples is inevitable, just as multiculturalism and these kind of things are inevitable. There's an ever-evolving movement of love as it unifies. Naturally, that's the end game. Love wins in the end. And even though there are seasons and cycles of shadow and patterns and all of that that emerge and rise and fall, and once more, you know, just think about war. You know, it rises and it falls. There's always a war somewhere. Interestingly, there's always a conflict. There's always difference. There's always separation. There's always clamours for power, prestige, esteem, success. And there's always a hierarchical structure to our institutions, our families, to ourselves perhaps. The way in which we think about ourselves, from good to bad, our families, again, our communities, you know, whether we feel superior or inferior to our neighbours, to our, you know, the different postcodes. We have this thing in Britain, don't we, this postcode wars of the younger people, county lines, you know, there's all these kind of divisions and hierarchies and structures, from politics down to homelessness. We could look at it like that. And so the division of things is always within the unification of things, but love does win in the end. If you look at the great myths, be it the Jesus story, be it the Buddha story, be it the Luke Skywalker story, or most movies that come out of Hollywood, if you look at the mythical nature of the story, if you look at Joseph Campbell's work around mythologies, you'll see that it's the perennial journey of the human animal is to keep retelling that same story. This is often why Hollywood makes the same movies over and over again, because really there's one story pulsing through the human experience. And this is the story of, and this is born out of our spiritual traditions as well, the story out of the human individual that is parented and nurtured and brought up in a loving environment. This is the story. It's not always the same story, but brought up in an environment where they're nurtured, and then there's the development of a sense of self and the ego, and then there's the leaving home, the going out from community and family with the tools that have been passed on through generations. And we go out into the world and we fall and we make mistakes and we intuit and we apply the language and the activities that we've been taught, and we see which ones work and which ones don't. And some of us find a measure of success in that. of all types, financial, emotional, psychological, that all speaks to our sense of self and whether what life is going well for us or not. But we move out and we apply the best teaching that our parents have given us, and often we've just been given wretched teaching or very poor teaching, or just patterns and puzzles of cycles of generations that is frankly can often be unhealthy. So we move out with unhealthy patterns in our sense of self. Maybe there's an effort to try and overcome those, but most of us modulate between the direction we believe our life to be going in, the accumulative notion of what our sense of self says our life should look like and what direction it's supposed to go in. Aren't we educationally taught to choose a career path before we're 16 and be somehow academically invested in making that happen whilst we're still children, really? That's kind of how our education system works, isn't it? So there's a lot of pressure in that, and of course cracks are showing within that for young people. School children kill themselves, from exam pressure. I'm not dismissing education. It's everything I think I learned at school was the nuts and bolts of what I really learned later on, and the nuts and bolts were essential. But I missed playing out a lot more than I got around to. So our world looks a bit like that, doesn't it? And along the way, we celebrate our successes. And along the way, we medicate our failures. So we find ways of enhancing our reality when we're younger people, and we have that. We move out of the home and we move into the world, and when things are going well, it's amazing, isn't it? And we have all the answers, and we feel satisfied that life is going well. And there's an invincibility to youth, isn't there? That we feel as if everything is in front of us. I don't know if any of you guys are still young enough to feel like, I don't know where my life's going, and that's fine. I know 4 years ago, nearly 5 years ago, I reached 50, and there's a very clear experience, born out of experiences like the first time a young man asked me if I wanted help with my shopping. And I regret that I didn't take him up on that offer. And out of experiences of quite frequently and more often than not being in environments around people where everyone else is younger than me. And I'm not saying I'm really old, but there was a movement of now feeling like I'm in a world where when I look around me, there's more younger people than me in the world than there are older people than me, which is really quite an interest. So you begin to ask different questions, as age develops, of course. So I'm not in a life where I'm trying to become somebody anymore. I don't have a 5 or 10 year plan. I don't have a 5-minute plan. I don't even know what I'm going to say after I finish saying I don't know what I'm going to say. That's how little planning I put into things, and that's been about moving towards self-acceptance and being okay with who I am. And I still lose sight of that, and losing sight of being okay with who I am is being okay with who I am. It's reconciling that inability or lack of access to this perception that I needed when I was younger of perfection, that everything had to be just so. And the flip side of everything being perfect and just so is to dismiss things that seem like I could never master them and be the best at them, which is why so often when we're young we can often speak, not exclusively, but often we speak with a bitter tongue about things we have no experience of, can be very dismissive. So there's a kind of walk through human experience of that. Now, in this time and tide that we find ourselves living in, it doesn't take much looking to see that there's a movement. There's just been a big election in America itself, hasn't it? Always a good template for experience, America. And that was an interesting movement between apparent shadow and apparent light. Often the human animal's difficulty is that we really like light, and we seek and covet light, and we want everything to be great, and we chase that and we seek that experience. And we don't have a very developed capacity for shadow and darkness and indifference and not knowing and mystery. Often when I work with people and they're at the beginning of a therapeutic or spiritual process, vulnerability comes very poorly to those that are new to learning how to suffer in safety. I worked a few years in recovery, rehabilitation. And my intuition became that I would say to people that were new that it's a really good place, rehab, to feel terrible in a safe place. And emotional sobriety, to use one of Bill Wilson's phrases, is a movement that develops out of the wisdom of the early work that we do, in which we discover, in which it is uncovered for us that to recover and to know emotional sobriety isn't that we feel great all the time and we can handle life and we're super successful. It is exactly the opposite. It's a counter-intuition. It flips. And when we encounter the inevitable sadness, inevitable difficulties of life, that we're able to, as the mystics say, not to bury our head in the sand and pretend this experience isn't happening, I don't want to think or feel about it. Or on the other hand, the second way is to try and go around it or self-medicate on it, but just to stare into the heart of a difficult experience, into not knowing, into mystery, into pain and suffering, and go, okay, come. And that takes time. It's not something you could share to a newcomer when they're the most important person in the meeting. You know, they're just not in that place. But later on, you know, there can be a lack of that. It takes wisdom, and wisdom teachers to talk in such a way. And wisdom teachers taught me that. I wouldn't want to say that I'm wise in any way. But I've heard that said, and it made sense. I recognised it as an absolute truth. So here we are, a movement of shadow and a movement of light. Always that. Light wins in the end, but they're not divided. Light and shadow aren't divided. There's always an apparent two. And there is me, and there's you, there's I, and there's other. There's this group over here and that group over there. Concepts of spiritual infancy are like, I'm in this group and you're in that group, and I believe these things and you believe those things. So they're still very dualistic. We define ourselves and define our group by not being the other group or not being the other person. So there's still that kind of like combat mentality that there's difference, and unification and the realization and embodiment of that comes much later on. So in terms of the notion of addiction in relation to everything it's taken this far to describe, there's a movement and an evolution, perhaps a devolution, so a reducing. I mean, they're both the same thing, really. You know, we might say, you know, things are evolving and things are devolving, but really, inevitably, they're the same thing. If you think of the yin-yang symbol, I'm sure you've all seen the white and the black of the yin-yang. It's interesting to know that the image is supposed to be a moving symbol, so they're both actually moving together as one. They're not different things, and as you can see from that symbol, it's just such a wonderful logos. They can't be separated. And as we said, you know, we like light, and we don't know what to do with darkness. Darkness often brings us into shock. So as inevitably we'd refer to the 12 steps and the work that Bill Wilson and the pioneers of AA did back in the late 20s and 30s. And you know, the 12 steps are an amazing engine for transformation. They're a reimagining of the Gospels as they were originally interpreted. That is essentially that we come to fullness, capital F, or we come to love with a capital L, or to use a religious word, we come to God by getting it wrong, not by getting it right. So if we look at the first step, we admitted, who wants to do that for a start? Who wants to admit anything? But we admit powerlessness. I have no power. And there's a phrase which arguably is true, that, you know, the admittance of defeat is a long way there. I would say it's some way there, but it's far from being a long way there. Acknowledging I mean, most of us could say that we could acknowledge a problem a long time before we come to the end of our relationship to that problem. But regardless, that's semantics. But the consciousness of powerlessness is an emptying out of all previous programs, all previous plans, and the ideas for the personality, in the personality, for how life was supposed to work out. Now, often this is a tedious process. The best way I've heard it articulated is my friend Susan, who I worked with in treatment, and she said, it's a place where finally we come to a simple thought that arises that says, there has to be another way. And I think that's a really good start. You know, there are many ways I've heard rock bottoms described. Naturally, the most frequent one is that it's about the way in which our lives look on the outside externals. It cannot be that, because millionaires reach the same rock bottom that the homeless street addict reaches. So it cannot be about outside conditions and circumstances, can it? How could it be? Certainly inwardly, it is that place. It is the same place for all of us. I can't do this, we might say. But with I can't do this, we might say this thousands of times. How many mornings have we got up and said, I can't do this? Yet we finally, it's a place where that thought comes as, you know, I can't say it any clearer, and it seems insufficient to say it like that. There has to be another way, which you can hear as a thought beyond I can't do this. I can't do this is like, right, I don't want to do what I've been doing. And there has to be another way is like the next thought. In that, it's imagining there must be something else. But I think here's the caveat that I can see from my own experience, and in this description, I would say it's the third thought that comes after that, which is the knowing, being awake to, being very clear that I don't know what that other way is. One of Bill Wilson's ideas I think it's in the chapter there as a solution, is he spends about a page talking about the alcoholic, to use one particular substance, who has vague excuses for why he thinks his life is working out the way it is, and that in his heart he really doesn't know why he does it. I think he says that sometimes these excuses has a certain plausibility, but in our hearts we do not know why we do it. But it's that certain plausibility, right? So if you were working with people with addictions, the question to ask them is, what's the plan? And if you encounter an individual that says, well, I thought I'd get a sponsor, do this work, or quite often, most of the people I work with who aren't in 12-step culture talk about getting a job. You know, there's this idea that I'm going to immediately rebuild my life, and often these are men as well. And I'm going to rebuild my life by becoming a man and standing up and working. And it's doomed to failure. This one, I have seen thousands of people, don't get me wrong, that decide to do something else and stop. Maybe they're people that are chemically dependent and therefore not an addict of the type that I'm talking about here. Yeah. To ask an individual, what's the plan? If an individual has a plan, they're probably going to have to go through that plan and either see its success and become free, or see it fail and end up back in front of someone who says to them, what's the plan? When an individual arrives at a space where they're able to say, I don't know. Wow. You know, and again, like most absolute truth, it doesn't take a lot of articulation or access to vocabulary to say. It sounds like nothing, doesn't it? But it's the beginning of everything. Because we go from, I can't do this, to there has to be another way, to I don't know what the other way is. Or perhaps in the middle there I should have put, I think it's this way, and so we go around that way and perhaps that fails, and then there has to be another way. So the next thing is to say, this person seems like they know another way. Can you help me? And then we're there, aren't we? I don't know. Can you help me? So if I'm asking someone, what's the plan? And they still know what the plan is, I probably can't help them. Because that idea, that seed in their sense of self, will give them an alternative to the help that's being offered, which the help being offered probably won't look like that idea. So Bill's kind of built up this idea of we come to love, or we come to know our true self, or we come to freedom, not but in success and wholeness and peace and purpose and servant-heartedness, not by gaining those as attributes in our life, though of course many do, but often we come to that sense of wholeness and completion and comfort and purpose by first the collapse of the failure of the plans for the first half of life. As Carl Jung said, the programs for the first half of life, somewhere between the age of 35 and 50, 55, become our neuroses. If you think about that place of the dark night of the soul, of the emptying out of those programs, of what the 12-steppers call rock bottom, it's a collapse of how things were supposed to be. And when the more radical and the more empty that experience is, then the more powerful the transformation. Transformation is, we can hear what's wrapped up in that word, transform. Form is to be put together, isn't it? And trans, whether it's transcript, to write words that are spoken, whether it's transcendental, to go from one state to another, or whether it's transcontinental, to move from one continent to another, or transatlantic, to go across the Atlantic. There is the place where I am and the place where I get to. It's from one state to another. So to be transformed is to move from here to there and to be formed in the process between. So the 12 steps is a process of transformation, isn't it? We begin at powerlessness and we arrive at power, as the 12 steps describe, not of our own. So it's a wonderful vehicle for that. In fact, as Franciscan Richard Rohr has said many times, the 12-step engine and the work of Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob is the most significant contribution American culture made to the world of spirituality in the last century. That's amazing, isn't it? You know, the predominating paradigm in America still for addiction recovery is still the 12 steps. Here, less so. We have harm reduction communities. So we have this idea that people have capacity to make bad choices. So let's give them the tools and the resources to make bad choices in safety. And that's also fine. It's not what some people would call recovery, but having worked in the harm reduction field, an individual moving from 70 milligrams of methadone down to 30 milligrams of methadone, if they choose to call that recovery, then that particular way of looking at addiction would say, yeah, that's okay. If you stabilize on 30 milligrams of methadone for the rest of your life and you want to call that recovery, then to you that's recovery. And there's some truth in that, which is challenging to abstinence-based peoples, who's to say in the end. But there's certainly, just as there is in every other way that we look at things now, an evolution around the ideas of what addiction is. As the human effort, the human consciousness, the human movement, the human waltz, as I like to call it, a dance through time and space, evolves and devolves at the same time as the yin and yang of the human experiment modulates. As we do have access to more information, we also have access to more things that we can read and see and experience about the world, which are terribly difficult to encounter. And we also have access to wonderful support for that, or educational items, or we have Zoom, you know, where we can all sit in different parts of the world and pass on information. So again, you know, there's great movements of broadening information. I mean, new information can bring about change, and change can be challenging, and that challenge can bring about the end of what was, because we're given new information to consider. So there's an inevitable letting go of what was in order to process and become increasingly okay with what is, or not, or reject it, or want to run away from it. But just it's ongoing, isn't it? Generation after generation. When I became a vegetarian in the 80s, it was a very left field thing to do. Now, 30 years later, it's a lifestyle choice that some people choose to adopt, and still many don't. When I first used ecstasy in the 90s, it seemed to be part of a social and cultural almost post-Thatcher notion, taking Thatcher's ideas of do it yourself and you can earn money out of it, and creating an entire counterculture out of that as wise-ass business folk took that into the subculture and put on big parties and sold lots of drugs and gave lots of young people a place to express freedom and liberation and unity. And just like the movement of the 60s, we didn't do anything with it, but we created a narrative in human history about dance music and that sense of freedom. And of course, psychedelics point to, they're very good resources for pointing to an inner sense of freedom, and there was a unifying for young peoples out of that. And of course, it also leads to deepening drug addiction crisis and problems in later life with our bodies. I've got some nice gout on my big toe on my left foot as a result of all the dancing and drumming. But there it is. So as everything is now evolving, so is the work that Bill and Bob started years ago. We know that, or there's evidence that, or there is at least opinion that at the beginning of AA in the late 30s, there's a rumour of a 75% success rate. And there's information that one can see about that, of why it was. For example, they used to interview people to see if they were really committed. So people would have to persuade a panel of 6 people whether they really wanted this way of life, and if they didn't let them join. Most of these people were men of once great earning capacity and very few women, which is why some of that literature written at that time says, even with women at some time, or even with young people, because it was written for the time that it was in. And that's okay. Bill was very careful when he wrote, "Thus we grow." And we will all be, if we've been around 12-step culture, very familiar with the phrase, God will constantly disclose more to you and to us. He wrote, "We realize we know only a little." Now, when you think they wrote a text that was the amalgamation of every single piece of knowledge they could gather at the time, psychological, all the spiritual work they could at the time out of the temperance movement, the Washingtonians maybe, but there were 2 temperance movements, wasn't there, and the abolition of alcohol that Bill wrote about in his story. So they had all those experiences that they'd directly been through themselves, so they accumulated the best of the knowledge that they could put into that text at the time. But he still wrote on the last page of the program, "We realize we know only a little," because he was wise enough to know that we would grow and things would change. So Bill's vision of opening rehabs, of plying every alcoholic with vitamin B, all these things he couldn't get past conference, and the movement in America of the Hazelden organization, which was when some of their first rehabs around the mid to late 50s, like a psychological and therapeutic recovery community that you can pay a lot of money to access, or even pay a little in some circumstances. But there's the rehab movement developed out of that, wasn't there? And then with the advent of different types of therapies beyond behavioral psychology and person-centered therapy, we now have cognitive behavioral therapy and Albert Ellis's rational emotive behavioral therapy that bore CBT. So now, our therapeutic engine, our medical model for addiction is that we have a problem with drinking drugs. We go to the GP sends us to the local drug and alcohol service. We're assessed, we're offered a triage, we may be given a drink diary. They may, if they're really progressive, let us know about 12-step meetings. My experience is many don't, just as many 12-step people are very disparaging about harm reduction agencies. Who's to say? So consequently, 12-step meetings are full of people that would do really well in harm reduction agencies that aren't doing so well in 12-step meetings. But in order to feel like they fit in and belong, say, "My name's Debbie, I'm an alcoholic," with no idea of what an alcoholic is. Individuals, when they move into environments and situations, particularly in this example where it's born out of desperation, the desire to comply is incredible. People will do anything to feel like they fit in. And there is, in reality, there needs to be an effort, an apparent willingness that is seen by other people to be integrating, that usually appears out of beginning to say things that other people are saying. So we start to use words like resentment and grateful and tell our drinking stories, so we necessarily integrate so that we can become part of the community. There's no way around that. That's not the whole of the apple either. That's the beginning, isn't it? Human beings, in terms of transformation, of moving from this state to that, will often sense, feel, know the initial experience of change. So many people will perhaps go to a recovery meeting or have a few sessions of therapy, and sensing a way other than their current way, call that complete transformation. To use a 12-step analogy, that would be the people that go to meetings and being satisfied with the sense of belonging somewhere and being okay being a drunk and hearing people talking about, urinating themselves and shitting the bed. And once they're around that stuff and there's a perception that, oh, well, I didn't do that, or I did do that, and it must be okay, I'm not the only person who shit the bed. That feeling okay about not being okay can be enough to call that transformation sufficient. We know that what often happens is quite soon that feeling wears off. It begins to be not okay being around what at first felt okay. But some people will sense that first motion of change, and that would be enough for them. They tend to be quite difficult to be around if you're around them, because they're not what Bill might have called emotionally sober. It can be quite sketchy and reactive and get triggered really easy. And that's fine. Recovery groups are a place where anyone who has a difficulty with alcohol or substance misuse or food can go, but never assume that everyone there is of the type described in the text that Bill Wilson wrote, or that everyone there is an alcoholic. AA is a place for people with drinking problems. But as I said, there's a necessity that if you wish to speak, you have to call yourself an alcoholic. And what we can do there is easily give ourselves a label that isn't necessarily accurate. It would be much healthier to invest in the work that goes on the recovery program. And I've worked with a number of people using that recovery program a few years ago when they went through the work and found they weren't alcoholics of the type described in the book, went off and got on with their lives quite nicely. So there can be a little trap there at the beginning. If anyone wants to find it, if they are an alcoholic or an addict or not, do the work, because it will show you whether you are or whether you're not. And if they finish the work, that would be amazing too, because many don't. What is it then to draw this together that is evolving and is changing? I no longer identify with the word recovery in relation to myself. I don't describe myself as someone who's in recovery. In fact, 12-step culture is the only phenomena in the world where recovery isn't a phase you go through when you're first being treated for the condition that you're in. In fact, that was Bill's intention, which is why the first line of his book says thousands of men and women who have recovered, because they only ever saw themselves as that. But as psychology got mixed with spirituality, and eventually the psychological and even the psychiatric overtook, the psychiatric and psychological community, those people that did sense more and made it into a accessing local services and medical services and the GP and all of that, won't entertain what they would call religious conversion of the 12 steps. There's still an idea that it's about God and it's about spirituality. Oh, not even that really. So they reject it wholesale because, there's still this evolving debate between religion and science, isn't there? So unfortunately that cuts a lot of people off, and that's evolving too in emerging communities like science and non-duality and spiritual sciences. I recovered a long time ago from the desire to use substances. I moved through a period of recovering in 2004, and then I did a piece of work towards the end of 2006, and at the end of that I'd recovered from substance misuse. And what happened was from the character of Billy, the drug addict, arose the character Billy the recovery person. So the person was the same, but I now had a new language, a community, sober-mindedness, access to ideas of making amends, of self-reflection. There's a 12-step absolutely must be a process of what is this experience saying about me, of looking at ourself. A better way of living and working in the world. You know, I studied psychology as Billy in recovery. I did some counselling training as Billy in recovery. I met my wife and married as Billy in recovery. And Billy did a lot of things. I worked with a lot of people in 12-step culture and did a lot of talking in 12-step culture, a bit like today really, still doing a lot of talking. And then I moved through an experience of returning to addiction off the back of a prescription pad. So I was impaled on a fence after a diabetic passed out at the steering wheel and came up on the pavement, picked me up with the front of his car, the grille of his car, and the car, myself and he, smashed into the fence, and the fence went up my armpit and didn't come out the other side. So I ended up impaled on a fence and spent 6 nights in 2012 in an induced coma, having had my spine, top of my spine bolted together in 2 places, my armpit sewn back on, a collapsed lung reinflated, some bone cut off of my hip and placed into the 2 vertebrae at the back of my neck and screwed in, lacerations all over my body, 2 breaks in my left shin bone, which I've got 2 platinum plates in holding it together. And that's not to describe the inner heartache and the brokenness as the program, Recovery Billy, collapsed. I didn't have sufficient, I wasn't in a place where Billy was sufficiently emotionally sober to deal with that paradox and that mystery and that unknowing. People tell me that it would be fair to be pretty challenged by an experience of that, as I went through 5 years of trauma related to my own mortality at the age of 50. So I was confronted with an experience, body and mind could be seen as absent had it not been the way that it actually was. Later, through a few years of therapy, there was a thread connected to that, and coming home on the day when my mother had died, to be told, your mother died today at 2:30. So from that statement, and we'll all hear brutal statements, the final one we hear is, you're not going to make it. We're all going to hear that one day. So I was brought up really close to that experience when I woke up in intensive care after 6 nights of being in the coma to hear, you've been in an accident. And I said, yeah, I can see something's not right. Because last thing I don't remember the incident, I don't remember anything about it. I just remember clicking my phone off on my way home from a recovery group and saying to my friend George, see you soon. That was a whole 2 minutes of walking. Think how long you can get in 2 minutes before I got hit. But I don't remember anything after saying goodbye to my friend George, because the trauma just disassociated that. And I think the amount of ketamine they gave me on the scene disassociated a lot of that. I was at the scene for 2 hours, but the heartbreak and the connection of mortality and that thread in relation to the way I perceived Billy my whole life, that was a real breakthrough in therapy, making that connection. So I attended once more to the recovery community and began about the process of rebuilding Billy. And I went through 2 12-step models. I went through 1-step model that when I wrote inventory, I wrote about, first thing I had to look for was my expectation on the dynamic of my relationship between myself and the person that in the self I resented. So, and that was okay. But within about 3 months, I wasn't following any discipline again. I was blocked off again. I was picking up more resentments. And I've been around that community enough, this community enough, to know that the work I'd done wasn't sufficient to set me free. Essentially, it hadn't worked. That can happen. If I'm not clear as I go through from the beginning, I can come out the other side of it and I can either congratulate myself and believe that I'm doing okay just because I finished it. And I've done that. That tends to be what happens when we do the work the first time. I've done the work. Hurrah, I'll go to the meeting. I finished my work today. You know, and there's kind of like, it's good for the ego. I did the work of Codependence Anonymous, so I did a lot of relationship work, and that was brilliant. That really took me to another place, but I wasn't free. And then I worked with a guy out of San Diego doing a piece of work called Big Book Awakening, and that was really something of depth and weight. It took me months to do it, and it started as a process of, it was a motion of feeling 5 months of being me, gathering intellectual information. It wasn't learning new things, it was unlearning all the old things. It was an unpacking, it was a subtraction. And at the end of it, I was absolutely clear that I was free. I knew what I knew, that I was free. And it was, it was just a cosmic, 3 years of like unpacking the trauma and the consequences and arriving at an appearance of safety. And then as I began to express that Big Book Awakening Billy, I made a new character yet again and started the UK's first PBA meeting, which is where I met Shirley, when there was me, her and one other person in the world, in the UK's first BBA meeting. There's the three of us sitting there being BBA UK. Well, Shirley was a newcomer. But there she is, so it works if you work it. And then the guy from San Diego, Steve, my friend, flew over from there, and we put on the BBA UK convention. And so I was becoming BBA Billy and promoting myself doing that. And then I had a recognition experience. It's the only way I can describe it, as I sat listening to a guy called Paul Hederman talking about the 12 steps, access to new information. And as I was listening to him over 3 talks, about 2 hours over 3 talks, he misquoted St. Francis, and he said, it's like St. Francis said, what's looking is what you're looking for. And I think every preceding experience, right up until I sat present to that experience of listening to him say that, was in preparation for that statement. What's looking is what you're looking for. Because there I was, once more looking out of this new character that I was building and identifying as Big Book Awakening Billy. And I realised that I was doing lots of looking again. I was listening to Paul Hederman right then, looking for more. Always more. If I do this, or if I get to that goal, or if I read that book, or if I do this work, or if I do that work, this time I'll really get there, and here's how. And every activity in the entire 50 years preceding that, a new toy, a new job when I leave school, a new drug, a new drink, a new relationship. All of these things, at first they all work. The veil parts for a minute and it seems like, yes, this is really it this time. And then soon that sense of something missing, or that sense of lack returns, or that sense of it not being quite enough, or not being what I thought it was, would return. And the cycle of seeking would begin again for this character that really was an imagined person I took myself to be, that I called Billy, and thought there was nothing but that. It was an experience of, for the first time, nothing at all happened, because the statement enabled the realization that there was no person to look for anything to happen to explain that. It was the end of the Billy program, and I sat in the presence of the absence of a person called Billy, and there was just, I looked around the room and everything was just the way it was, and there was no thought about it. And it wasn't ecstatic, it wasn't spiritual, it wasn't divine, it was ordinary, and it was real. And I didn't have to think about it or feel it, and there was I got nothing out of it, there was nothing to get out of it. What it was an experience of endless nothingness. And it was so satisfying. And it wasn't an experience I could have brought about by works. So quickly the Big Book Awakening Billy, that character also went pop, and I became increasingly disinterested in that plan, because I could see it was taking me down a path of rebuilding myself as some character that I could project out to other people. And since then, the last 3 years, I've really just been embodying that. And what it's taught me, the way in which I work now with addiction, is that the items of addiction, be they gambling, food, tobacco, chaos, creating alcohol, drugs, codependent behaviours, pornography, whatever. The objects of fixture and fascination to the person aren't the problem. They never were they? Those are the medication for the problem, and I'm the problem. But what is this I that is the problem? And it's the conditioned personality that we take ourselves to be. The essence of that is the thinker. We think we are our thinking, and we think these are my thoughts. And it's that my that we become interested in it. So what this enables with addiction is to recover from the character and not from the objects of fascination. The larger proportion of people recover as a self, just as I did earlier on. As I said, I went from using Billy to recovery Billy, but the Billy was still intact. I just had a different set of tools with which to be Billy and become increasingly comfortable being Billy. 2018, when I was listening to St. Francis Ways, I recovered from being Billy, which is why sometimes you'll see my recordings with a strange name, because of course I'm still essentially Billy, but Billy is a construct. It was a character put together by family, schooling, the absence of religious training, which is religious training. It's just the absence of it. Atheism is just nega religion, really. It's a different belief system and a different idea of what I believe. And the accumulation of experiences that I went through that shaped and made me who I was. I realised that in all my efforts, in all the different tools and identities that I'd had, I hadn't quite arrived yet, but there I was at 52, still waiting to arrive at some destination that I couldn't describe to you even if you asked me. And so recognition at that point, there was no destination. In fact, it was the realization that I am the destination. So when I work with people now and I do some BBA work with them, because I do still use the tools occasionally, because it's a fantastic piece of work for addiction, I point out to them from the beginning that we're not going through the work to get anywhere or get anything or arrive at an experience of something. We're going through to unpack all of the attempts to ever get anywhere and to subtract all of the efforts and the energies and the very personality, so that what remains is recognized as ever present all along. And I say this to you, that you are the spiritual awakening, and you always have been. It's not an event. It's not a feeling. It's not an experience to be brought about by works. It's what you are before all efforts and before all work. And so the steps must be a process of emptying out, so that the light of your true self is the only thing that remains.